James Walker, an elderly black veteran, just wanted to board his flight and peacefully reunite with his family. But instead, he found himself humiliated and detained by a young white employee who eyed him with suspicion, as if James were not a decorated general, but a suspected criminal. Everything changed when his service patches caught the light, and the truth came out. What happened next would have stunned even the most experienced. But let's go back to the very beginning. James Walker slowly approached the boarding counter at the airport. Passengers bustled around him, hurrying to catch their flights, but James, an elderly black man, remained calm, though he felt a slight tension building inside. He was already aware that in situations like this, he might be treated differently. It had become a part of his life. When it was his turn, the airline employee, a young white man, briefly glanced at James and, frowning, reached out to take his ticket. James handed over his printed boarding pass, but he sensed a shift in the atmosphere. The employee's gaze was scrutinizing, as if he saw not a passenger, but someone to be regarded with suspicion. "Are you really on this flight?" the employee asked coldly, studying the ticket longer than necessary. "Yes, here's my ticket," James replied calmly, his voice steady, though inside he felt a familiar twinge of anxiety. He had gotten used to these kinds of situations, but each time it stirred an inner struggle. The employee glanced at the computer screen, checking something, then slowly looked up. "Wait a minute, sir. I need to verify your documents," he said, avoiding eye contact with James and motioning for him to step aside. James remained standing, watching as other passengers passed by without a second glance. Young, affluent people, most of whom were white, casually showed their tickets and proceeded to the boarding gate. None of them faced additional scrutiny. It was something James had grown accustomed to, but it never ceased to hurt. He knew it wasn't his age or appearance that raised suspicions. It was his skin color. People passing by glanced at James with curiosity, but no one offered assistance. Some openly ignored his presence, trying not to linger on the scene, as if it were something routine. Inside, James felt the weight of fatigue building. Once again, he stood to the side, as if his very existence was something that needed to be questioned. James stood aside, leaning on his cane, feeling anger and resentment growing inside. Once again, a familiar scene unfolded before him. In his eyes, it was an injustice that had become part of his life. He glanced at the other passengers. Some looked at him with sympathy, but no one dared to intervene. Memories from the past resurfaced. He recalled being arrested as a young man just for being in the wrong neighborhood, denied service in restaurants, and suspected wherever he went. He had been through a lot: wars, racism, loss. But every time his dignity was questioned, it burned inside. "Don't stay silent, Dad," his son's words echoed in his mind. Michael had always been a fighter, a young activist unafraid to speak out against injustice. They often argued about it. James was more restrained, preferring peaceful resolutions, although deep down, he knew Michael was right. He remembered how his son had insisted, "If not you, then who? If even you stay silent, they'll keep thinking we don't deserve respect. You deserve better." Those words had struck James then, and now, standing aside, he realized that this was the moment to make a decision. An internal struggle ignited within him. He found it hard to engage in conflicts. He had grown accustomed to life demanding patience and endurance, but the constant humiliation weighed heavily on his soul. He could have simply complied, waited for the check to be completed, and moved on. But something inside him protested. He thought again of his son, and how Michael had once helped an elderly black woman in a store who had been refused service. That was a moment when James felt proud of his son, proud of his strength and courage. And now, Michael would surely be watching him, waiting. "Dad, don't stay silent." James understood that this wasn't just about checking documents. It was a challenge to his dignity. His son's voice and the support of his family became a source of strength in this moment. He straightened up, despite the pain in his back, and stepped forward, deciding that he would no longer remain silent. Determined not to give in, James approached the counter as the employee finally returned. In his hands was James's passport, which he had handed over from the beginning. However, despite completing the check, the same wariness was still visible on the young airline worker's face. "Your documents are fine, but we need to check your luggage," he said, his voice clearly indicating an intention to keep stalling James. Those words made James pause for a second. He felt his patience wearing thin. "What exactly is the issue? I've already passed security, and so has my luggage," he said calmly but firmly. The young man remained silent, avoiding eye contact. This silence, this evasion, it was all becoming crystal clear. James wasn't being stopped because of his luggage or his documents, but because of how he looked. Other passengers began to notice what was happening. Someone in line had already taken out a phone to record the situation. People started whispering, and someone quietly said to the worker, "What are you doing? Why are you holding him up?" James, deciding he had had enough, took off his jacket to retrieve his documents from the inside pocket. At that moment, the golden stars of his general's insignia became visible on his shoulders. The people around him froze. It was a moment that changed everything. The young employee froze when his eyes fell on the insignia. Realization hit him suddenly, like a cold wave. He understood that the man standing before him wasn't just any passenger he could subject to unnecessary scrutiny. This was a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. "You're a general?" he stammered, his voice no longer harsh or arrogant. Now it was filled with fear and regret. James looked directly at him, his face calm, but there was determination in his eyes. "Yes, I'm General Walker. I served this country so people could live freely, without fear or prejudice. And every time I face this kind of treatment, I ask myself, what was I fighting for?" By this point, several passengers were recording the scene on their phones. The video quickly began circulating on social media, and the situation was rapidly gaining attention. In the comments, people started writing about the injustice, about how James was being discriminated against solely because of his skin color, despite his service. The video went viral, gathering thousands of views. The young employee, clearly flustered, realized he had made a big mistake. He understood that this was no longer just a delay for a passenger, but a situation that could ruin his career and damage the company's reputation. Within minutes, the video of the incident had spread across social networks. People were discussing what they had seen. How is this possible? How can someone be treated like this? Someone who has dedicated their life to serving the country. Veterans from around the world began voicing their support for James, commenting that he was their brother in arms and that such incidents of discrimination were unacceptable. The airline, sensing the growing public outrage, quickly issued an official statement apologizing to James Walker and his family, and promised to conduct an internal investigation and review its procedures to prevent such cases from happening again. The employee, Tom, was temporarily suspended, but it was clear from his expression that his transformation had begun not out of fear of losing his job, but from a deep realization of his mistake. He approached James and quietly said, "I truly didn't understand. I'm sorry. This wasn't just a coincidence. I have a lot to reconsider." James, recognizing his sincerity, nodded. He knew that change doesn't happen overnight, but any recognition of wrongdoing is the first step. He placed a hand on Tom's shoulder, as if passing on a lesson learned through pain and shame. The situation ended with James calmly boarding his flight, while the video of his story continued to gather millions of views, becoming a symbol of the fight for black rights and against systemic racism. The next day, his story was in the headlines. Society was discussing not only this specific incident, but the broader issue of bias and discrimination. For James, it was not just a personal victory, but a step toward a greater acknowledgement that the fight for equality is a long journey, and each case is an important lesson for the future.